So hello and welcome back to Climbing on Mount Sophia. Today I'm happy to be here with my brother Aaron. He's been on the channel before with me and Steve. We've been for a long time using a term and seeing it pop up more and more in conversations in the online space as well. And the term is NPC, or non-player character. And so we've been talking about kind of trying to flesh that out and try to put some kind of landscape, some kind of stability to the landscape around and through this notion of the NPC. So Aaron has done a lot of thinking about this, I think. So maybe if you want to start out, like, where does this term come from, and how do you see it in kind of like a basic, just use the everyday term?
Yeah, I mean, that's what kind of oriented our awareness towards it. Is I think that found myself using the term and encountering it, and I felt like it would, there's a reason why we start using terms, and it's a term that clicked pretty well for me because I've grown up in a fairly connected internet culture environment with forums and stuff like that. So it's not a new term by any means. And while I'm not like a prolific gamer, I've done enough gaming that I've encountered, these for probably 15 or 20 years in different formats. And as it started to, I think, show up more frequently in our conversations online and even with each other, there was a point probably 4 or 5 months ago where I started to feel like some red flags around it.
Mm-hmm.
And we discussed it a little bit then, and it's kind of popped up here and there. So it seemed like it's an interesting thing to identify and study something that's kind of emerging like that. But it's also, the case that there's not a lot of clear definition around it. And therefore, I don't think there's consistent application of the terminology at all, maybe. And even the concepts around it are probably kind of cloudy. And, the case is, like, if you go and search for a definition for the term online, like, you can find one on Urban Dictionary, but you're not going to find one in Merriam-Webster. It's just, it's a relatively recently emergent term. But it's got legs, and it's got legs for reasons.
Mm-hmm.
So, as I
like
started,
it primarily has to do with like a spectrum of agency. It's a distinction in terms of the how agentic an entity is in a given arena or domain.
Yeah, so I think that's a good way to describe sort of the abstract notion, because for historical purposes, the emergence comes from multiplayer gaming, originally like board games and stuff, where there were play masters and whatnot or the game master can play players that, or characters within the game that have sort of defined parameters of operation, and other actual live players can interact with them. And that translated then into digital formats, and we see them in all kinds of games. And there is absolutely that element about them, right? They're constrained into very distinct parameters of operation. And
it's like you walk up to a character when you're playing Skyrim or Assassin's Creed or whatever, and you can say, like, you have 4 different lines you can say to them, and they can say something back, and like you can go through like maybe 3 or 4 different pathways of a conversation, maybe if they're a fairly complex one. Otherwise, they're just like pretty straightforward. They're almost like part of the arena sometimes, when they're just there and they only do one thing. Like
there's a pretty clearly deterministic aspect about them.
Okay.
I think that is what you then what then translates into that ascription of agency that goes along with the term, because our experience is one of probabilities, and that is the way everyone who has a perspective or perception of agency operates in the world, and that
Say
is
more about
not.
what you mean there.
So, I mean, that would be, I think, a functional description of agency in a sense, right? Like if everything is deterministic, then agency is zero.
Right.
And so, the actual reality that we experience is one of probabilities, within lots of constraints, but still, probabilistic and outcomes and optionality.
What I'll say, I just listened to episode 3 of After Socrates last night, and there's the definition John uses there of agency I thought was really good. It was basically an entity that can perceive the likely outcome of their decisions and thus shift their decision making in order to hopefully, and this is maybe your probabilities, right? You're hopefully attain some desired outcome of a decision, but there actually is the choice of this or that because this or that.
And it's also not deterministic that even if you do the optimal thing, that you will achieve the outcome desired.
Right, exactly.
You know what I mean? Like probabilities apply across all kinds of spectrum.
Right.
Whereas the NPC is operational within a defined parameter, right? It's within the game, right? It doesn't act outside the game. It doesn't have anything beyond that, like you do as the live player participating in the game. And so, it's like I'm thinking of a game like Fallout, where, in some, you can play for hundreds of hours, and there are multiple potential outcomes to the game, depending on kind of the alliances that you make and your interactions with the non-playing characters in the game. And that means that, because there's sort of this, the interactions tend to go something like, you go up and initiate an interaction, and then there are 4 potential ways that you can respond to their response, and depending on a hierarchy of the way that you choose to answer them and interact in individual interactions, and then interactions over time and throughout, like, over hundreds of hours of gameplay, like, there is this potential for it to go to, take almost unique and different paths, or within a fairly broad range, but it's bounded, definitely bounded.
Yeah. And this,
right. And it's all programmed
yeah,
from the beginning by the people who build the game. All the responses, all the potential responses that can come to any of your responses to an interaction, because your responses are bounded within the game.
Yeah.
This is a deterministic framework, and that is where the NPC exists. So, based on my interactions with NPCs in games like that, I started to extrapolate that into, what happens if you start to treat other individuals in the world like an NPC. Because,
or maybe even just picking up on patterns, right? Like that's like, for me, it showed up as like, okay, so take, for example, right? Like, we just had our first child, and there's like an NPC line that comes depending on what stage you're at, right? Like, while you're pregnant, the NPC line is, are you having a boy or a girl? Now, that doesn't mean that everyone uses that line as an NPC, but it's like, it's like hard code in your societal cultural response mechanism. It's like, you have to ask that question. It seems like everybody asks it. And so that's just a simple example, but you can scale that up in terms of, especially, okay, I want to point out 2 things. First, there's this ontology thing that you brought in there. That's like, the NPC is relegated. Their being is dependent on the game structure itself, right? Like, they're in the game. And this is one of the really significant dangers with the use of the term as applied to humans, is you cannot make this term an ontological, like you have to distinguish that you're not making an ontological claim about the being status of the individual, because you very quickly start, making a hierarchy of who's valuable and who's not in their actual existence. And that's not, can't go there. But I think there is something interesting there that we can go into later in terms of like where your consciousness maybe gets stuck. But the other thing is, if you're, the way this translates over is like, if you're engaging with a certain person and all they can do is some lower level, like canned, programmed, response mechanism, and you just can't go outside that with them, then it's like, okay, maybe this is something like an NPC in real life. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I think absolutely that's why the term has legs and the app gets the application that it does. There's a reason why we were using the word without really having a formal idea of the definitions or anything like that. It's because it has a descriptive element that's got an accuracy to it.
Mm-hmm.
And then, yeah, I think like you just illustrated there, that it becomes a level of application and analysis where you go from, wow, this seems like a perfect term that fits and is so descriptively accurate of my experience, to one that's like afforded genocide.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
In a sense, because my experience as I was thinking about this, and like when I interact with an NPC in a game environment, it's an extractive interaction. Like it's pathological.
They're purely instrumental.
They're tools. You use them as long as you need them for whatever you can use them for.
Yeah.
And as soon as they don't have utility for you anymore, like it makes sense to discard them in whatever way that occurs in the game you're playing.
Yeah.
But that's an orientation that like you're just going to naturally fall into as you play the game. If you're going to successfully, navigate the game, you have to use the NPCs. That's what they're in there for, is for those different interactive experiences that point you and lead you in certain directions.
Yeah.
That provide the bounding of the experience in a sense.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's, that's all deterministic and that's all bounded and all of that. So this is where I think it falls into like a really deep misapplication when you extrapolate it to human individuals, right? It's like, there's no question that there are plenty of people from different points of view that will regurgitate canned information on cue just like that.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And it makes this seem so descriptive, I think, because that seems deterministic.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If I can predict that, it's like when you go and you interact with an NPC in a game that you've had, say, like a failed interaction with before, like you've never made it to the second layer of interactions with them. Yeah. You just start over. I mean, sometimes with a negative connotation already applied, like they're already in a bad mood because you've had a failed interaction with them already. But like, you're going to get exactly the same options that you got the first time. Or one way or another, you have to get through that first layer of interactions to reach the second layer of utility that NPC offers.
Yeah. So it's almost, it's like, it's important to note that when you're talking about an NPC at the level of a gaming environment, it's what they are. But when you turn around and use the term symbolically in relation to how it, because really I'm trying to situate the way in which this is a helpful term. It's helpful in the sense of understanding the level to which you should take a person seriously in a conversation, or their positions on things seriously. And it's like, so then when you transfer over to using it in kind of a symbolic real world sense, it becomes a term that is descriptive of a level at which the person is engaging in their own life. but it is not what they are. And it's really important to make that distinction.
I think I have an intuition that it's something like a gauge of agency,
Mhm.
right? That you sense from the person, right? Like that's the signal that you translate as, well, this feels like NPC interaction.
Yeah.
I've really backed off from using the term.
Mm.
So I'm not fully convinced that there's
Because
a
of this
really
problem or other problems?
mostly because, well, I mean, I think words need to communicate ideas if they're worth using. And if I can't use a term like that without being misunderstood,
Yeah,
I shouldn't use it.
sure.
You know what I mean? And if it's not defined, then I think it's, fraught with potential for misunderstanding
Yeah.
by everyone who uses it. And, like my impression is that most people who use it are doing so because of that sort of intuition about the agency that they're encountering, especially at its scale in mass, lots of people regurgitating the same information.
Yeah, yeah.
It's like, that's a difficult signal to squelch.
Yeah.
And you probably shouldn't. The question is like how to categorize it in a way that's, beneficial, I guess, or positive if it can be.
I see. Okay.
And I'm not sure, like, to some degree, I think that's why I wanted to talk with you about it. So we can just kind of chat through what do we think it means,
Yeah.
because defining it is the first step to being able to use it.
Yeah, yeah.
And, I really don't think most people are looking at it pathologically and thinking, the people around me that appear to have low agency have the same equal value to a deterministic non-player character in a game environment. That's not my assumption,
No.
but
we need to
there
guard
feels
against it
like
if we're
a dangerous slope there
yeah,
with a
yeah.
term like that, because the actual say embodiment of a relationship to an NPC is one of just like psychopathy.
Yeah. I
It's
think
like,
I only watched the first season of Westworld, but I think you get a good sense of that there. But
I didn't watch that, but I've heard it's kind of that way.
yeah. So let me make a proposal as to what an NPC is, and until you understand me, and then we'll flip and you do it, and then we'll talk from there. So as NPC at the level of an actual real individual person, I think has to do with the kinds of things you take to be true a priori. So if you hold something as unquestionable, you're unwilling to examine it, whether this is a propositional belief, whether it's a procedural belief, you get stuck there, right? Like you can't move around it. And so it's like, to the degree that you're unable to access your own relevance realization beyond a certain point, right? Say you have this level where I have this belief, right? Like evolution can't be right, because then, my belief in Christianity falls apart. Let's just take that as one that we grew up with on some level, right? And it's like, okay, when I run into any kind of situation that requires me to use the evolutionary lenses, I become an NPC. I become an NPC who simply manifests the necessary outcomes of that position. And that's all I can, and I'm bounded into a deterministic frame that is open from that lens. And so whatever level to which, because we're all, so in this way, I suppose in this way of coming at it, we would all be NPCs in some, like you can be an NPC in one area and not another. So Yeah, I think it's something like your agency is limited because of a priori positions that you're unwilling to consider maybe wrong.
Yeah, I think that's pretty accurate. And I would reuse a lot of that. There's does seem to be something like a spectrum of potential to participate in the experience of, say, being an NPC.
Mm.
I think because that's kind of what you just described, right? It's like, maybe you to let me back up and do it this way. If the actual reality that we inhabit and experience is one of infinite potential that operates like probabilistically on a hierarchy of constraints ranging from more to less artificial, then the bounding that gets applied, right, to the what becomes a deterministic framework is an artificial construct. And that is the chain by which you bind yourself, I think, which is what you were just describing. It's like a lack of willingness or ability, or for some reason, that results in a disintegration, creates an artificially bounded frame of experience in your life, right? It's like you said, it's like information can no longer be integrated because it conflicts somewhere, or it to engage it raises a tension or a pain or a trauma or something like that. For some reason there's a disintegration, right? Like then there's a limitation on what's otherwise infinite potential, right? That's artificially imposed. And maybe that's, I mean, it seems to me that the actual expression of the NPC, because it's a necessary regurgitation of limitations that come from above in a hierarchy.
Okay, so hold on.
Let's go to that, because I think that makes more sense.
Let me state back what I've heard you say so far, which is something like, so this is predicated on a notion that we've talked about before, which is that we live in constraint hierarchies, and constraints generate affordances. Specifically, the relationship between constraints, right? The constraints of me being in a bipedal human body and the constraint of gravity, together with the constraint of the floor, afford walking. Now, and it sounds like you're saying the question is, to what level are you afforded agency? And that an NPC, the more you're an NPC, it's like the more artificial the constraints that you live within, something like that.
It seems to be, it's like it feels more like an acquiescence to an imposition, right?
Okay,
because
so it's coming from outside yourself. So maybe that's part of it.
That seems to be a better fit, actually. Like, because I think that thing that we were talking about before, where that sort of arises from an internal disintegration of the experience, like, I don't think that's quite the same thing, really, right?
Yeah.
Like, I think what this is it's like appeal to outside authority.
Yeah, because the NPC in the video game is programmed by whoever built the
right
program.
exactly.
So it's like you're running someone whenever you're running someone else's artificial constraints, you've become an NPC who's so you might say that, right? Like if I don't know, let's try to make a non-controversial example. Like if I'm really
if it's
committed,
ideological and it has smacks at all of something an NPC might embrace, then it's probably not going to be non-confrontational.
well, let's say this. How about I'm a really big fan of Newtonian physics and I just hate quantum everything, and so I'm really unwilling to consider that. I'm running Newton's program, circa the 1700s, whenever Newton was around, and that's as far as I can go. But it has to do with like I like to think of the idea space that's running on your cognition in terms of programming. So it's like, okay, what program are you running? Well, I liked this person, I like the way they wrote this program, and so that's the one I'm going to use, and I will not stray outside it.
Probably even that plus something like anything that doesn't run on this is a lie, right? Or it's just like information that can't enter your space at all, your information space, right?
So as an NPC, you're necessarily like
you're constrained and limited to running the, it's like if you run a minority tier operating system, you're probably going to end up limited in the applications you have access to, because the number of people who develop for your niche market operating system is pretty limited. And so then everything outside of that becomes something you can't run. And maybe
this is a good way of pointing out how it becomes isolationist too, because even if you're running the program that everyone else in your culture is running at the moment, like you're segmenting yourself off.
And I think there's a tendency to develop a lot of really really critical legacy dependencies. So let me give you, I think that would bridge then into, all kinds of, like, say, ideological systems of thinking, right? That actually persist across time and, transcend individuals and all that kind of thing, right? And they become a system that you can then default to for, answers, solutions, truth. And adherence to that at some point becomes a closing off of yourself to anything else, like all the other new information that might contradict or conflict with that. And that's highly limiting. It's like, maybe you start off with a pretty, say, stable operating system of ideological thinking, or whatever, that orients you fairly well. But this is something that is we're all just constantly bombarded with these days, is the reality that, like, progress is occurring at rapid speeds in all kinds of fields, and they're interacting, and it all piles on, and you're behind on something or everything all the time. And that puts us all in a position of, like, trying to qualify information and figure out where it fits, and, like, should I reframe my thinking, or does that reinforce my thinking, or right? What information is valid, what information is actually not true? And we're constantly trying to sift through all these things. And to some degree, people have been doing that forever across time, but that seems to have accelerated significantly. And we're still trying
access,
and we still operate essentially the same kind of software systems at the even like a firmware level for trying to process this stuff, right? Like below an operating system of, say, an ideological structure of meaning, or truth, sense making, or whatever, value, right? Value hierarchies and all of that. So, I guess it seems like to the degree that you express and inhabit anything like that, right, or embody anything like that, you become an NPC.
Mhm.
Your responses become predictive and canned and, limited to within a certain space. The information that you can even engage with, much less integrate, is really limited. And I don't know. I guess it puts you in something like an artificially deterministic framework in a sense.
Yeah. Well,
Like it makes certain areas of your life or experience seem or appear deterministic. It's
a
like,
lot of it.
you know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because
Well, and this,
that's what we're picking up on when it's like, oh, this is the response I absolutely expected because this is the person that this seems to be.
and
This
it
is the
becomes,
character that this person seems to be playing.
yeah. Yeah. And it becomes deeply, everything feels deterministic, and thus you become a victim of everything because it's playing outside of your reference frame.
It feels a
So
lot like a Jungian, ideas having people.
yeah. And then there's because there's archetypes too, right? And that's part of this, although I think an archetype's a different thing because that goes way deeper. I think an archetype is distinguished from an NPC because an archetype goes down into the deep sub and unconscious layers of adaptation to an unbelievably complex world. And so I think that's much deeper, whereas an NPC is a shallower thing. I don't think an NPC goes deeper than the level of the will, let's say, right, of a choice to adhere to a certain level of artificial constraints. And I think our archetypes go deeper. But I do want to bring up the notion of like possession by higher order spirits, which Jonathan Pajot and John Vervaeke in their most recent conversation had. I think they're making good progress in kind of understanding this, but like the notion of giving body to a higher order collective intelligence is part of what we're saying here. It's like I think to be an NPC is in some way to say be possessed by some higher order intelligence set of ideas that are manifesting into space via the time of whoever will serve them, to layer on a couple of lenses from like Steve's language.
Well, it seems intuitive that adopting a rigid structure and framework of thinking like that would free up a lot of processor that could be used for something.
You would think, but it doesn't, right? Like,
well, I mean, the question of possession then
right,
becomes
not,
where does it go, or
yeah,
what gets to use that extra processing.
sure. Oh, that's interesting. Sure. So here's something, right?
I mean,
It's like,
that's attention too,
yeah,
right?
but
It's the opportunity to, I mean, from that aspect, it's the opportunity to sabotage an awareness in a sense, right? And
yeah, which is
if attention is something like, the portals of energy, right, that that we're building the world with through attention, right, and then a possession like that would offer probably a lot of opportunities, right,
yeah,
especially in scale, at mass, right?
and I think so. So the question that's coming in for me then is like, how does one become an NPC? Because it strikes me that it has to do with what's the word I'm looking for here? Being tricked, being duped, right? It's because I don't think anybody, maybe some people, but I think in general, it's not people who are NPCs really believe that they're right. So how does, like, what is there some kind of internal propensity to it, or is it a kind of external parasitic process that overtakes them? Obviously it's probably neither. It's a function of the relationship between the two.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm thinking back to earlier in the conversation, we were talking about experiencing it as a spectrum also, right? Where maybe some portions of someone might be really constrained and other portions might still be relatively open.
Yeah.
Because it seems like you definitely experience that, and maybe that's what we all are to some degree, to whatever degree we're ideologically possessed in one way or another.
Yeah.
But
we're still definitely an NPC on plenty of levels, I'm sure.
Try not to presume transcendence.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, no, absolutely.
It does seem like there's a lot of say robust storylines throughout history of people being tricked, right? Usually through some sort of base temptation, or a temptation held out to a relatively base part of, almost what you might consider animalistic elements of human nature.
Mm-hmm.
So that seems to be persistent. Offers of wealth, or offers of power, offers of this, offers of that. But it seems to me like generally it's, you break it down to something like high time preference, exploitation, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like
it's almost like anytime you've chosen an instrumental good, you're opening, you're becoming open to the possession.
You've been offered a shortcut.
Yeah.
In a sense, right? It's like, well, here's the truth about this. Now you can believe it and stop worrying about things that relate to this.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah,
so you say, okay, lock that in. And, that extrapolates into other areas because everything eventually touches everything else in some way, but that, I mean, I think in some regard, that's probably present in that process.
Yeah.
I don't know if that would be the only way I could see those kind of things functioning. I mean, I think people are persuaded into ideological frameworks of thinking for lots of different reasons.
Yeah. So maybe the final question that we should ask and come at is, let's say I have someone that I'm interacting with where it's just quite clear that they're unable to engage any kind of ideas outside of a specific framework. They're really running an NPC kind of life. What's the way in which, what's the optimal way to engage?
Probably not to treat them like an NPC.
Yeah.
Like,
well, maybe that's an
interesting
interesting way that you become an NPC, right? Is you treat others instrumentally like NPCs, and then like you're going to become like, that's going to do something almost worse to you. Sorry, that just came up for me as you said that, but
that's interesting though. Yeah. So, this is something, because I think when we first started kind of using the term, we were using it to describe something like you're just talking about, right? Like someone that you interact with that seems to be asleep in a sense, right? Their eyes are closed. You can't really have something like a genuine, honest interaction with them because you don't ever actually get them,
Yeah.
you know. And
Yeah. You're forever just talking to a program.
so then, like this is obviously our question arose a lot like it has throughout the history of Christianity, right? It was like, well, when someone doesn't see, well, how do you wake them up, right? Like,
Yeah.
like, and as far as I can tell, like there is no actual mechanism for that say you can initiate that's 100% effective and successful every time, because there's something about still lurking, I think, even in the human NPC character that is still embedded in the probabilistic, actually has agency real world.
Yeah.
And it's still that agency that you have to appeal
Yeah.
to break anything out, or anyone out of an ideological framework,
Yeah.
to break yourself out of an ideological framework. Like
Yeah.
it's always an appeal back to that, I think. And so interacting with someone like that, I think probably the best thing you could do is treat them like they have agency,
Yeah.
and maybe that's agape in a sense,
Yeah.
right? It's like
Yeah.
to treat them like they have agency, even though everything that keeps coming back to you is predictable, like they're operating in a you know prescribed, constrained, formatted,
Yeah.
deterministic environment.
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe if you do that well, right? Like if you do that well and you do it in such a way that is never confrontational, but you just kind of ask them to notice, right? Like
Appeal, yeah,
yeah, like
it's an appeal for sure.
yeah, and you just ask them to notice something, but you treat them as if they have agency, so they feel like they have agency, at least in the conversation with you, and that may trigger their agency to start to wake up a little bit.
Seems like something like that. I mean, um there definitely doesn't seem to be a track record of success through coercion, or you
Well,
know like anything that you might describe as traditional means of influencing people. You know what I mean? Like those lead to ideological frameworks.
yeah, like you never, like the worst thing you can do actually is debate. Like and I feel like that's what you see all over social media and Twitter especially, where it's people doing these confrontational kind of back and forths about some subject, and it's like all you're doing is reinforcing the mechanism, because like you said, the question is not to what are they an NPC, or by what are they possessed. The issue is just that they are, right? I don't care what your framework is. I want you to be like, the goal is to become real. And I'll put in a plug here because I forgot to mention it earlier, for Free Guy. Like that movie is the the perfect representation of this notion. It's like you if you're and this, like so much of this comes to Jesus, right? It's like the call is never to become something specific. The call is to become real. It's not to adhere to a certain set of things. This is, I think where Christianity always goes wrong. It's like it's a way, but the way is a way of being.
And I think probably maybe it's about orientation.
Mm.
It's a follower of the way, right? A seeker of the truth, right? Not a knower of the truth, not, the paver of the way. You know what I mean? Like, it's that orientation that, is described by honest, open interaction with intentionality to integrate and to, I guess what I'm always trying to do is either challenge my preconceptions and use the new information that I encounter, especially when I can qualify it, to either reinforce or recalibrate or something, all of those pillars of thinking, right, or the principles that seem to be described by all of the other information.
Yeah.
And there's sometimes you can do that at higher resolution, sometimes it's low resolution, sometimes you're not doing it well at all, and you're just like running code in a sense, right? And there are certainly times where, say like time constraints force you to react to something. That's definitely just like running base code. But those are the times when it's so important that you've been recalibrating and refining all of your principal points of reference, because when you go kind of like call those things at low resolution in an instant, the more accurate they are, the higher the probability that your outcome is going to be successful.
Yeah. And it's almost, I guess, something that I also thought of there was like, you can notice how much of an NPC you're being based on how much resistance you're encountering, right? What kind of feedback are you getting from your own experience to the fittedness of reality that you're engaged in? It's like, okay, if I'm poorly fitted, there's resistance somewhere. I'm getting that feedback.
I feel like if you're probably that in tuned to your awareness and your attention, and you're processing feedback with that kind of intentionality, you're probably already in a pretty actively functional place. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
to the
That's
degree,
like too abstract of a.
it's like if you're operating, say, software that's, say, got a bunch of external dependencies. It depends on someone else's code to run this part, and it requires somebody else's code to inform you on this part. And like, you've just like picked and chose and you put them together and it's running your application, right? Whatever you are. But like, to the degree that you've externalized dependencies, you've also, delegated trust across all of those different dependencies. And, like, this happens all the time, to go back to like the software, like legacy software issues that can arise. It's like, those can be real significant vulnerabilities. For one thing, they don't update, or they might not be updating, or you might not get the update to it. It's like, if you've tied a significant portion of your belief structure to the teachings of someone from 50 years ago, then there's going to be information that's occurred since then that we've encountered as people that probably isn't going to be accounted for within that model. And what do you do with it? Well, maybe that person for the next 50 years has continued to morph and change, and you can go off of what they have produced still, but eventually you can't.
Yeah.
Right. And like, we have idea systems that are all built on top of each other, going far back, and we can't even hardly, dissect them.
Yeah. Well, this makes me think of like the third wave Platonism and what John's trying to do in After Socrates. It's like, if it's knowledge that generates non-propositional transcendence, then it bypasses this kind of network, right? Like, the problem the problem in some sense when you're running NPC code is like the code is the propositions in some way. Like the code for uptaking someone else's ideas is the propositions that it's communicated in. And if you're hard coding the propositions,
maybe it's predicated on some propositions at least.
Right. So your hard code is based on this set of propositions. It's like, okay, now this is all I can play off of. This is that artificial constraint. But if instead the propositions are all like you engage with the propositions in such a way that they point you underneath them and beyond them, then like, because the thing that I don't want to say is like, oh, I just have to invent myself. It's like, no, I can internalize Socrates. I can like pay attention and learn this code, let's say, but in such a way that it actually becomes alive in me. I'm not just running a dead set of ideas.
Well, I agree. I think there's what you're describing kind of is wisdom, right? That knowledge that's not just transient propositional kind of thing, right? And like that's what we're trying to achieve in a sense. And the reason why you can appeal back to someone like Socrates is because what Socrates was building and operating, as far as I can tell, was an adaptive model. It wasn't static software.
I love this, like how John spends a whole episode. Have you watched any of them yet?
The first two.
The first two. So in the second one, right, when he's Socrates the monstrous, the whole point is that he's in that middle place. And it's like, and that's the point. The point is you're never committed on either side. The point is you're always transitioning and actively fitting.
Right. Yeah, that's why I think it's something that we can appeal back to and pull forward a lot of value by, sort of embodying the principles that he was proposing, is because it's adaptive and it's iterative, and it's explicitly so, and it's supposed to be that way individually, expressed, and it's got a built-in mechanism for, say, develop or working out the irregularities that you encounter between individuals, right, who are practicing something like this.
Yep.
That's the dialogue. But it is specific, like you mentioned before, how negative debate can be, and the sense in which it can be kind of self-reinforcing, right? Really, where this dialogue from a position of honest, open, explorative, orientation is so powerful.
Yeah, no, that feels good. Do you have anything else you feel like you want to add?
No, like we didn't really know where this would go and where it would end and all that. And like, I don't know still that we've, say, put a pin in answering what NPCs, what are, how we should use the term necessarily. Like it's not I don't feel like we put a definition in place necessarily, but we definitely put some long-winded kind of pointers towards definitions, I think. And hopefully appropriately highlighted some of the potential dangers, I guess, of inserting terminology like this into our discourse without having real clear a real clear concept of how it can impact our orientation towards other people. Because I feel like that's what the temptation is with a term like this, right? Is that when you actually start to apply it, you could start to treat people really horribly with absolute justification for doing so, because that's how you treat NPCs.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I'm thanks for bringing it up and wanted to do a conversation about it. I've wanted to talk about it multiple times, so this is good. And I agree. Like I think it does serve usefulness, but I think it's fraught with a lot of danger. So I
Well, it's
I don't know.
descriptive and
Yeah.
it's got some accuracy, so there's a reason why we use it. But I do think, like where we landed earlier, like the orientation that we should have towards anybody that has, let's say, pings your NPC radar, is to treat them like they have agency, which is the
Yeah.
way we're kind of extolled to treat everyone.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's the important thing, to take the legs out of the possibility of the others. Like, hey, just because they're an NPC, it doesn't mean you should write them off. Maybe you, it's like it's a ping to maybe relegate the way you weight the information they give back to you.
It's a qualifier.
Yeah, but in no way,
Yeah.
If anything, it should enhance the quality of the attention that you pay them, because they're someone in need of your love, really.
Yeah.
So,
And I think there is something that everyone responds to in an appeal to agency.
yeah.
In a sense, it's when it's done with love, right?
Yeah.
Like, that's, if there's anything that's going to be compelling to someone who's ideologically possessed, it's the idea that they could think for themselves.
Yeah. All right. Hey, well, thanks for joining.
Yeah, man, it's a pleasure.